This is our first presentation on net zero emissions targets. And Elena.
Thanks, Jay. I'll try. And you may think, why has Detlef grown some hair if you have seen Detlef on the program, but I'll present in his stead. We did this paper together with also my colleague Michel de Nelson. It has been published already, so feel free to tweet about it using hashtag IEMC2021. Right, that was a small advertisement. So what we did is look at cost optimal 1.5 and 2 degree scenarios by IEMs. So those scenarios were developed in the CD Links project, and they were developed by these models, AIM, image, message, pulse, remind, and which. And we were asking ourselves, when do the 10 big emitters reach net zero greenhouse gas or CO2 emissions in these scenarios? So looking at the countries listed on the right, how does that actually depend on methodological or definition choices like land use, BECS, equity? I'll come back to that. And which factors can actually explain the differences between countries that we see. Just to remind you, many of these countries actually have already set net zero targets, often for 2050 total greenhouse gas emissions, and in some cases for other years or with a question mark about the scope. So going straight to the main results, here you see the projected phase-out years in the scenarios. In the upper row, it's for 1.5 degree case, and the lower row is for the 2 degrees. The left shows total CO2 emissions. On the right, it's total greenhouse gas emissions. And in the middle, it's CO2 from energy and industry only. And then the vertical lines are the global average for comparison. And you see the full model range, but the enlarged circle represents the model median. And basically what we see here is that some countries like Brazil and USA are generally projected to phase out greenhouse gas emissions and CO2 emissions earlier than the global average. China, Russia, EU are similar to the global average, and Indonesia and India are generally a bit later than the global average in these cost optimal scenarios. We can also put the targets on top of this picture, and we see that then actually many of the net zero targets are consistent with these cost optimal scenarios. So often even with 1.5 degrees. For some countries, it's not entirely clear if they relate to total greenhouse gas emissions, but if they do, that would also be in line. And only in the case of Canada and Brazil, the scenarios phase out emissions earlier in the 1.5 degree case than the stated net zero target. That's one element. The next is the issue of definitions, choices, or methodological issues, and we looked into a couple. Basically, the first is using the land use data according to the national inventories rather than the model data. The second is the allocation of negative emissions realized through BECS to the biomass producer rather than the country applying the CCS. Another one is global warming potentials, but since that didn't have much effect, I won't focus on that here. And the final one is looking at the equity ranges rather than the cost optimal case. So starting with the land use one, what you see in these graphs is always the difference in the projected phase out year between the default case being the cost optimal one and the sensitivity case, in this case, the land use data, where you see that actually in all countries except Brazil, using the land use data according to the national inventory would lead to an earlier net zero year. And that's because of this known effect of different definitions, where in the models, this is basically what we have. And in the national inventories, parties add this category managed forests. So they account for CO2 uptake by managed forests and count that as a sink. So that basically means that emissions according to the inventories are lower than what we have in the models. And if you then harmonize to that inventory data, basically shift the whole pathway down, and therefore also seeing an earlier net zero year, except for Brazil, where the emissions in the inventory are actually higher than in the models, and therefore leading to a later phase out year in this method. That's one of the sensitivity issues. The other one is the allocation of negative emissions that are realized through BECS to the biomass producers, rather than the country applying the biomass with the CCS. And that, as expected, leads to an earlier phase-out year in the biomass exporting countries like Brazil and Canada, while biomass importing countries like EU and Japan would see later phase-out years with this kind of allocation. The final issue that we looked at is equity, so using actually the ranges provided by Robio Dupont et al. And comparing that to the cost optimal case. And there you see that many of the countries that we studied would need to phase out greenhouse gas emissions earlier, and countries with lower per capita emissions or lower income would actually reach net zero a bit later. Finally, we looked at, can we actually explain these differences that we've seen between countries other than those arising due to different definitions and methodological issues. And we did a couple of analyses, but I'll focus on the regression analysis here that shows the most important factors explaining the differences between countries. So on the one hand, leading to an earlier phase out, it's the potential for CCS and afforestation, but also the current share of transport emissions. And on the other hand, leading to a later phase out, the current share of non-CO2 emissions and GDP per capita. So basically the mitigation potential, and especially the one for negative emissions, really explains the differences in phase-out year between countries. And then finally, zooming in on a couple of countries, here we show the emissions in the year that the net zero is achieved for two illustrative models. For a country that reaches net zero early, like Brazil and USA, for a country that's about global average, China, and a country that's late in the phase-out year. And what we see here is that the negative emissions potential can compensate for the remaining non-CO2 emissions. So for example, the case of Brazil is interesting as it has relatively high share of non-CO2 emissions, but in these scenarios sees a relatively early phase-out. And that's because of this high afforestation negative emission potential. So that's the headline, the findings. We come to some recommendations based on this work. Is that first of all, that clear definitions and agreements are needed on the data and methods applied. So we looked at these issues like land use emissions and sinks and the accounting of negative emissions realized through BECCS. Another one that we studied was this equity part, and what you could conclude from that is that you either set a more ambitious domestic target or you compensate for that financially. So that's different ways to interpret these findings. Finally, we said, well, when determining and communicating a net zero target, it's of course also important to account for other national circumstances, and maybe there's synergies in other policy fields that may lead to a different choice as to the phase-out year. And of course, it's important to specify what kind of equity considerations play the role, which greenhouse gas emissions are covered. In the previous national session in this conference, I learned that China has definitely greenhouse gas emissions, but those kind of clarifications are really helpful. And learning from these findings that special attention will be needed for the intended use of negative emissions, as that played such a large role in determining when countries can reach net zero. That's it. I think I'm still in time and happy to take any questions.
You did a fantastic job going through a lot of really good material. Looks like we have one question already in the chat from Alan Fawcett, which is, does the Paris rule book provide any clarity on how emissions accounting for BECCS will be handled, or does that still need to be negotiated?
That's a very good question. And I will admit that being an observer to the Paris Agreement, I haven't been involved in all these negotiations. So I am not entirely sure, and I might not be the one to answer this question. But of course, there was progress on Article 6, so that might offer some starting point for this. But I think, but correct me if I'm wrong, I haven't seen any specific guidance on this issue. So that's why we thought it would be good to bring this to the attention also of the negotiators.
Absolutely. Take the liberty of asking a question, and if you followed this path, you either need to have the individual countries taking up these paths and putting them forward independently, but that would mean that countries like Brazil would have to become extremely aggressive in their emissions mitigation. And as a developing country, that might be a hard domestic political sell. On the other hand, if you had something like Article 6, then they could be compensated. But the flip side of that is that those countries which would meet a net zero later then become the buyers, and then it puts countries like India as a buyer rather than a seller, and it, so I don't know if you have thoughts about this, because it is going to be an issue that needs to be discussed, and I think your paper really just shines a spotlight on these kinds of issues. So I'm not asking you to solve it, but if you've given some thought to it, I really, I think it'd be great to hear about it.
Yeah, so I think this is exactly the reason why we brought in all these extra elements, like cost optimal scenarios from global IANs are not the only answer to this question. And we also actually stated in the paper that it's important to also apply like national models and other tools simultaneously to try and answer these kind of questions. And that's also what happens in projects like CD Links that informed this scenario setup. So I think it's definitely important to also try and look beyond these kind of cost optimal outcomes. And the other end is indeed what we say on interpreting it. Like it could mean you do this domestically. The other part is indeed the financial and all the Article 6 kind of provisions. So I think that's definitely a part of the answer. But yeah, it becomes political quite easily. So as a scientist, I wouldn't have the solution indeed for that. But maybe one of my co-authors would still like to add some thoughts here, or
we may have to move on to the next session. Thank you. That was really interesting. Our next paper is allocating global COVID-19 recovery packages over low carbon technologies to optimize between emissions reductions and employment gains. Konstantinos?
Thank you. So I am Konstantinos Koasidis. I am a PhD student and a researcher at the National Technical University of Athens. And I'm from the coordinating side of the Paris Reinforce project, which is among the Horizon 2020 projects supporting the design of new climate policies using integrated assessment models. So amidst our modeling work, COVID-19 emerged and many interesting policy relevant questions came alive. And in particular, employment was hit really hard during the pandemic, with millions of jobs lost, and unfortunately, some of them permanently. And although there was much talk about green recovery and building back better, only a small portion of the fiscal plans that were allocated globally was towards green projects. So in Paris Reinforce, we asked the question, what if countries used some of these recovery packages to finance clean energy projects? And especially, what's the best way to allocate these short-term funds to maximize impacts in terms of both job creation and emission reductions within this decade? So to answer this question, we employed a 5-step methodology based on the GCAM model and employment factors to model job implications of recovery scenarios. And then we used OCMECON-R, a portfolio analysis technique to produce the investment mixes coupled with a Monte Carlo simulation to account for uncertainty. Without delving into very much details, to briefly take you through the steps of the methodology, we used the GCA model, which allows simulating a wide range of energy and climate policies. And as a baseline, we assumed where we're headed scenario logic, which builds on current policies up to 2030. In the model, the recovery was studied by first identifying a possible part of each region's recovery expenditures as subsidies allocated in 7 green technologies. So we then model the impact of these subsidies in 10 different levels per technology, assuming that there's a progressive increase until reaching the maximum value to create an exhaustive set of investment options and their returns in terms of both the energy mix and emission reductions. So this means that essentially for 7 technologies, we ran 70 different recovery scenarios and calculated for each country, assuming different levels of subsidization for each technology. So the model produced energy mixes. We converted these in net cumulative employment gains compared to this baseline that was established, using well-established databases in the literature with employment factors. For these factors, we adapted them based on technology cost projections over time until 2030. And especially for manufacturing and extraction jobs, the factors were also adapted based on current market shares. As a final step, and based on the previous calculations for each of the 70 recovery scenarios, we calculated the impact on emissions, and we have the impact on emissions and cumulative job years up to 2025 and 2030. So we used all these values in both bio-objective setups where we wanted to optimize both emission cuts and job implications in one of these 2 timelines, and also in 3 objective setups where we wanted to optimize all 3 objectives simultaneously. And after that, we ran a Monte Carlo simulation with 1,000 iterations, assuming a ±5% range in each of the modeling of the GCA modeling outcomes. To move on to the results section, first of all, we're starting with the EU because it had the most detailed description of the COVID Green Recovery Package, the RRF, spending an exact amount of share in the green recovery. So we used this region to develop the narrative of our process. So in the first intermediate GCAM results, what we observed was the contradicting nature of our 3 objectives, namely the emissions and short-term jobs and long-term jobs. So specifically what we saw was that technologies that performed well in terms of, let's say, employment up to 2030, like for example in the EU offshore wind, did not perform so well or suboptimally, to be fair, for employment up to 2025 or in the emission section. And this was also similar for all objectives, no matter where we're looking, with technologies having their ups and downs, and this was also the case for most countries. This was also validated in the bio-objective results. So in the EU, we first look into near-term employment opportunities along with emission cuts by the end of the century. And we did that because we figured that policymakers in the beginning might want to focus on immediate returns over these investments because the crisis was happening now. So what we calculated was a potential of up to 1.4 million job years, additional job years by 2025, and a capacity of cumulative emission reductions of up to 800 megatons of CO2 emissions until 2030. Always these values compared to our baseline scenario. But these values had clear trade-offs between them. So the format would rely heavily on onshore and offshore wind, while when shifting our priorities towards maximizing emission cuts. We saw that investment would also shift from mainly offshore wind to biofuels. Yet another interesting takeaway was that the portfolios designed to maximize short-term employment and emissions had actually a very poor performance in terms of longer-term jobs. So a key question that we had was, is it possible, and whether can we actually make these employment gains to be really sustained in the longer run? So we further investigated this by searching for green expenditure in terms of both emission cuts and also energy sector employment gains, but this time both by the end of the decade. So in this case, technological portfolios expectedly changed, and mostly in favor of offshore wind when we wanted to maximize jobs, and a combination of onshore wind and biofuels when we wanted to maximize emissions. And this change of horizon did not significantly undermine the interval of the emission cuts expected, with the upper bound remaining almost intact. But what we saw was a similar trend with our previous setup, meaning that the optimal portfolios designed to maximize jobs for 2030 jobs were found to be suboptimal and perform poorly in terms of short-term employment. Given all these dynamics, what we did was explore if the technological mix can be diversified towards a better balance between all three objectives, the near and longer term employment gains and emission cuts simultaneously this time. So we observed that the optimal budget allocations tend mostly to favor wind and biofuel technologies at different levels, complemented to add this diversity by small shares of the other technologies. And after accounting for uncertainty, we indicatively isolated the balanced portfolios, which you can see highlighted in the figure, which is a combination of offshore wind, biofuels, onshore wind, and biomass. The impact of this portfolio would have been would achieve all around 0.5 gigaton of CO2 emission reductions, and mainly 850 and 350,000 additional job years by 2025 and 2030 respectively. So what this means was that a small sacrifice needed to be made in all objectives to achieve this balance, and mostly this sacrifice was a little larger in terms of new energy sector jobs in the short term to avoid jeopardizing all the rest objectives. So broadening the geographic focus, we expectedly found that policy recommendations would change markedly depending on the region. So for example, in the US, we saw a similar trend as in Europe, but now in favor of PVs instead of wind, which was the case in Europe. But most importantly, we can see that the trade-offs between the different goals varied by region. One indicative example, for instance, is that in North America, USA and Canada, optimal portfolios seem to balance employment gains in both horizons without much conflict between the two. But even if there was no conflict between these two, there was a conflict with emissions. In contrast, in the other regions, we saw huge conflicts between job gains in 2025 and jobs in 2030, like we saw in the EU. The most strange case was Japan, where there was a significant clash between new employment in 2025 and all other two objectives. So just to summarize, overall, what we observed was that there are synergies between green recovery and employment gains, indicating that both goals can be achieved. We identified some clear trade-offs. One, we saw that there was a clear trade-off between employment and emission reductions. And second, we saw that there was a clear trade-off between short-term and long-term employment. So depending on the policymaker preferences or the policy orientation, the exercise could provide different investment mixes to achieve different goals. And because this is a work in progress, this has not been finalized. As the next steps, we intend to expand our analysis in multi-model setups, which would require some slight changes in the scenario protocol, and also add complexity in the portfolio analysis through more subsidy levels to increase accuracy. So thank you very much, and I remain at your disposal for any further questions.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you very much. Great presentation. I will usurp the chair's prerogative and just ask, could you explain a little bit more about the labor market? That seems to me to be a critical element. And how did you model that?
Yes, thank you for the question. So the case about the market share that I discussed with the employment factors was that a subsidy in a certain country would increase the installed capacity of a certain technology. But if we increase the installed capacity, that does not necessarily mean that all jobs will be in a specific country. So if we add capacity for PVs in Greece or any other European country, that doesn't mean that all the jobs that are related with this installation will be in Europe. The main problem here is mostly, let's say, manufacturing jobs. So what we did was take the ability of each region to produce, to manufacture the equipment required for a certain installation, and we saw whether this region or country could actually could produce all the demand inside the region. So if yes, we accounted all these jobs in the region, but if not, we adapted the employment factors using specific shares so as to take these jobs and take them to the country where they are actually produced. They actually happen.
And just to follow up briefly on this, were as emissions were mitigated, presumably we had less demand for jobs associated with producing fossil fuels and the use of fossil fuels. And did you take that into account, or is that on the table for future work?
So because our analysis was limited until 2030, those changes were not drastic. So we assumed that these market shares will remain essentially the same until 2030. But of course, you're right, if we expanded the time horizon, that would play a huge impact. And probably it would require different scenarios depending on how these market shares would evolve over time. But because we were limiting the analysis up to 2030, this was not so much of an issue in our case.
Great. Well, excellent presentation, excellent research. I think it's time now to get to our next presentation. Let's see, I thought, on the agenda, it was towards a net zero emissions world, and that this would be the following presentation toward net zero and the assessment of G20 countries' contributions. Raphael, I believe you're presenting. So please, the floor is yours.
So this is actually I'm presenting on behalf of many co-authors. It's a team of about, let's say, 20 or around 20 researchers involved in that project that actually is called the Global Energy and Climate Outlook, which has been published annually to provide updates on policies since the Paris Conference of the Parties in 2015. So in this year's GECO, actually we bring a detailed modeling analysis with regional and sectoral detail, and basically assessing current policies, assessing NDCs, but mostly the importance of long-term strategies and net zero pledges as well. And then we contrast these two scenarios with 1.5 pathways. And before bringing too much detail in our results, I would like to highlight a bit of the methods that are involved and to construct this report, because I think that's something relevant for us to look the effort involved, and looking from from an outside angle. When you read the report, you don't have properly the dimension that's all the work that is involved. I think that the same applies to the previous presentations from Heleen and Konstantinos. I think that's something relevant for us to highlight as researchers. So, as I mentioned, several models are applied in this, let's say, multi-dimensional analysis. We start with common assumptions for macroeconomic drivers like population and GDP. These are actually fed in feeding in our POLS model, which essentially is a bottom-up global energy system model that provides the projection of regional energy balances and so on, and actually is the core model of these reports. Also taking into account land use and agriculture emissions that we consider as an exogenous input to our analysis taken from Globion from IASA to project GHG emissions from land use and land use change and forestry sectors. Also taking into account another dimension of our analysis. So this first two also provide more or less the pathways in terms of emissions, but they are also relevant for our economic analysis. And here comes another piece of the story, let's say, where these projections are taken to build our baseline in a CGE model. So here you can see in the right, we have the pyramid feeding information into the JRC geometry model. The pyramid is actually a really nice framework to include and reconcile exogenous data into input-output tables, and then project these input-output tables to build, let's say, consistent baselines. And on the top of these baselines, which is a core part, of course, of any modeling effort, we do perform the scenario analysis on the CG model. This is one that I mentioned that brings the impacts of policies at macroeconomic levels and so on. But also POLS provides other information that can be fed into the games model, for instance, that for the analysis of air pollution, non-CO2 greenhouse gases emissions, and into the magic or FAIR, or to assess the climate responses in terms of temperature. So this is our, let's say, framework in terms of modeling. And now turning to our results. Now sharing some of the results. Let me first say that GCO is about to be published, not yet published, because another challenge during the preparation of the report was that for the NDC LTS scenario that we can see here in the screen, we had several updates from the different parties along the last month of October and the beginning of November. So we had to, we tried our best efforts to include everything that was we consider relevant for the long-term strategies of these countries. And hopefully, and I'm happy that we managed to make it. I would say on the time being of by the end of this year. And now, and looking at these results, let's say when we see that in the purple line on the top, we have our current policy scenarios in terms of GHG emissions. That would lead us to a temperature increase above 3 degrees. But fortunately, these NDCs and LTS strategies bend the curve, the pink curve, quite strongly, especially after 2030, and place the world towards a temperature increase of about 1.8 in our analysis. So this is significantly lower than our previous GCO's editions, but however, not sufficient to meet the Paris Agreement targets. We also contrast, as I mentioned, these, and you can see here in the line yellow and red lines below, our two analyses for the 1.5 scenarios, where we apply differentiated carbon prices across countries or uniform carbon prices across countries. And also we compare to our, as I mentioned in the dashed line here, to the NDC only scenario. That means excluding the long-term strategies of these pledges. So this comes, of course, as a consequence of a great energy transition. We can see here results for primary energy supply, where essentially primary energy is reduced through efficiency gains, in great part derived from electrification. There's also a strong phase out of coal energy in primary energy, where you can see here in the brown bar, in the brown area below. And this also plays a significant role in our NDC LTS scenario. But moving to higher ambitions, the 1.5 scenario, we rely pretty much not only on coal, but we can see here that natural gas also suffers a great reduction in terms of primary energy, and of course oil as well. Also, GCO brings important messages in terms of abatement options. So we can see in the graph, these two figures represent 2030 and 2050 in terms of different abatement options that we consider for the different scenarios where we have current policies, the NDC LTS, and here represented 1.5. As I mentioned, the largest emission reductions are due to the changes in the energy system, where deployment of wind, water, and solar are the main contributors here in this purple area. But also other sectors and regions need to contribute, as we've been discussing in the previous, in the first presentation, and their land use change plays a significant role for many countries, and this is something that I will highlight in a few transparencies, in a few slides on, because in the GCO these years we have a strong focus on building regional results for G20 countries. So you can find in the GCO individual fact sheets for the main emitters, and there we can see these global results with this with this huge regional heterogeneity across countries. We also bring the economics of transition analysis. So here we focus on the transition of jobs from fossil fuel sectors to low carbon oriented sectors. We see that in these, in our results, bioenergy and electrification lead to increased opportunities in these sectors. And however, although service-oriented sectors grow, they grow slightly less than the projected in the current policy scenarios. These are the red areas here. So in this graph here, in the right, the height of the bars represents the employment levels in 2050, and the horizontal axis we see the change from current policies in 2050. The bars and 2030 the dots. So we can see here that the long-term strategies play a significant role in changing the level of jobs on fossil fuel sectors as expected, but these sectors do not contribute the most to the economy in terms of employment levels. And one more important thing to mention that in our setup, we have a fixed employment. So all changes in employment here are absorbed, are taken or absorbed by other sectors. To finalize, let me conclude. We will briefly. We soon will have the report published. You can reach him. You can reach it in this link here in the screen. We have current policies leading to a temperature of about 3 degrees, but delivering on the NDC-LTS lead us to a 1.8 degrees Celsius, which is more in line to the 1.5 targets of Paris, but still the ambition gap remains. So there are significant efforts to be done by individual countries, and these are our highlighted results. These are highlighted in our results for regional differences in abatement options and in terms of economic impacts for each individual country fact sheet. I'll stop here, and I would like to thank you and leave the floor to you and the others. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks for putting up your email address so that people can do the follow-up. You covered a lot of material very quickly, and I know there will be great interest as people begin to dig into this. So stand by for a lot of questions and comments and requests for additional information. Let's just keep moving forward and being assessed short-term and long-term economic and environmental effects of deep decarbonization pathways in Tunisia. So let me turn the floor over to Meriem.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you very much. So I'm going to present you, as I said, Jay Edmonds, a paper which is entitled "Assessing Short-Term and Long-Term Economic and Environmental Effects of Deep Decarbonization Pathways in Tunisia." This is a work that has been done in collaboration with my two colleagues, Frédéric Reines and Gisela Londa, and this is a work that has been done also in collaboration and financed by the UNDP. Actually, to put things into context, let me remind, even if obviously everybody here knows that the Paris Agreement called on the parties to UNFCCC to undertake an ambitious climate policy to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. Another important point is that the elaboration of a deep decarbonization pathway strategy can actually represent for developing countries, and Tunisia in particular, a great opportunity to revitalize economic growth while reducing GHG emissions. So the idea of this work is exactly to investigate this point, to investigate the macroeconomic effects, at least, of the implementation of different measures, economic measures, that allows to achieve significant climate mitigation objectives. And this is done in the Tunisian context where we have a deficit of energy and a high dependence on fossil fuel imports. We have the burden of fossil fuel subsidies and on the public finances. We have a high energy bills for the poorest households, and so on and so on. So a lot of energy related issues. So the idea here is to look at what happens when we implement a significant penetration of renewable energies in the electricity mix, namely, and the objective that has been considered is to achieve an 80% renewables in the electricity mix by 2050. We consider also the total the progressive, but on a very short period to achieve a total removal of fossil fuel subsidies by 2025. And finally, the introduction of a carbon tax in the Tunisian economy in order to finance what is here the GTF is the green transition, the Tunisian fund. And we also have considered the introduction of price signals in order to achieve the energy consumption that have been foreseen in the national low carbon strategy. These three policies or measures has been implemented incrementally. I'll come back to this point later. I don't know if you see the bottom of my slides because I'm not seeing them actually, but okay, I think, I'm sorry. Just
not sure what's on the bottom if we can't see it, but the last line reads the productive sectors share the remaining amount.
Oh, sorry for this. Okay. Oops. Okay, let's try this. So yeah, the two important features is that we have considered, an important feature is that we have considered the recycling of carbon tax and energy subsidies revenues. This in order to stimulate the economic activities, in order to counterfight the recessionary effect of rising energy prices. And we have done this in two ways, following two very specific rules. For what concerns the carbon tax revenues, they have been used to feed the green Tunisian transition fund over the whole period considered, which is 2021 until 2050. And these revenues are reversed to households and businesses according to the priorities that are defined in this green transition fund, while energy subsidies revenues are recycled according a lump sum rule. Households get back the equivalent of the amount that has been removed from them in a lump sum form, and productive sectors or businesses share the remaining amount in proportion to the weight of employment of each sector in the total employment. Sorry. Oh, why it doesn't work? I'm trying to switch my. Oh, okay. So all this has been done using the 3Me model. So very, very quickly, it is the Tunisian version actually of the 3Me model, which is a multi-sector, it's a hybrid, it's a dynamic, it's an open source, and a general equilibrium model. Yeah. Very quickly, just to know that it relies on hybrid matrices where the economy is described both in money values and physical quantities. We have an annual time step. It's a recursive model. And a very important feature here to note is that we have prices that don't adjust instantaneously to clear markets. The prices and quantities actually adjust very slowly. And we have we have a producer that adjusts their supply to the demand, and this has the advantage to allow for a situation of market disequilibria. In particular, we can have the presence of involuntary unemployment. Yeah, and we have imperfect expectations for investment decisions. Okay, so let me come back. This is the value, yeah, just to have an idea about the implementation of the carbon tax. It starts with before 2030 with very small amount, and then after 2030 increase linearly with 9 Tunisian dinar per ton of CO2 until reaching an almost 400 Tunisian dinar per ton of CO2. Yeah, just to note, I'm coming now to the results, that all simulation results are actually presented in a standard way, but in terms of deviation to a baseline scenario. When we look at what happens in terms of CO2 emissions, we find that all the scenarios provide a continuous reduction of CO2 emission with a decrease of approximately 36% in 2000 at the end of the period in 2050 for the renewable scenario. For the renewable scenario case, about 42% at the same time horizon. When we add, in addition to renewable scenario, the removal of subsidies, and then we can see here that when we combine all the measures in order to achieve the national low carbon strategy in Tunisia, we achieve a reduction of almost 70%. When it comes to employment, what we observe is that although the effect in the different scenarios don't sum up exactly, as we have seen for the emission reduction, we actually observe a virtual accumulation of the positive effect which prevail. In the first scenario that is considered, that we have called renewable scenario, there's actually a continuous growth in additional jobs. Here, in the y-axis, you have the variation in absolute values comparing to the reference scenario, and we observe here an increase of 12,000 jobs in the first period in 2030, and about 118 in 2050. When we consider the renewable, when we actually add subsidies to this renewable scenario, we observe something that could be considered at the first as very strange, because the situation is worse, and we have then an increase during the period. We have an increase during the period of removal, and then a decrease. We observe an increase of 14,000 jobs in 2025 that are actually linked to the fact that we recycle the revenues of the removing of the subsidies, and then we have a deterioration of employment once this transfer stops. So then in the cumulative scenario, where we have the policy package with the carbon tax, we have a not job creation over the whole period. We achieve 51,000 in 2030, and about almost 200,000 jobs in 2050. When it comes to investment, the relative trends actually between scenarios are actually the same as for employment, with an amplified effect in the package scenario, the low carbon scenario. Actually, in 2050, the increase in investment is similar in the renewable scenario and the renewable plus subsidies, around plus 7.5%, and we observe a plus 12% with respect to the reference scenario in the national low carbon strategy scenario. This actually can be explained by the fact that we have a significant increase in investment in the electricity sector that is linked to renewable infrastructures and in the modernization of the network. And also the second explanation, main explanation actually, is related to the redistribution of the carbon tax revenues and subsidies that encourage actually investment in depollution processes, low carbon processes. And last point is that what we can observe between 2024 and 2031 is the recessionary effect that prevails in the scenario renewables plus subsidy scenarios. This can be explained by the fact that the amounts that are redistributed at that moment are not very high, and the share of renewables at that time is still quite low.
Meriem, could you finish this up? We've only got a minute left.
Yeah, okay. So very quickly, without entering into the number, when it comes to
go to the conclusion slide.
Yeah. So the conclusion is quite, The thing is that the main conclusion is that when we implement a national low carbon strategy that is quite stringent, this could lead to a double dividend. We can have a significant reduction in greenhouse gas emission and improvement in the macroeconomic situation. But this is very dependent on the way the carbon tax revenues and the energy subsidies revenues are recycled. And this is a key point in this in the implementation of such measures, in order to have this positive macroeconomic effect. So thank you very much. I'm done.
Not only want to hear about Colombia, but also Switzerland's national mitigation pathways toward net zero. And Evangelos.
Thank you very much, Jay, and welcome everyone to the Swiss part of the National Mitigation Pathways. I'm going to present results from a study that finished in March 2021 and lasted about 2.5 years. And Switzerland is a small mountainous country at the heart of Europe, famous for chocolate, for milk, cheese, and watches and other stuff. But it has also something that many countries are dreaming currently. It has a carbon-free electricity supply, thanks to large share of hydropower and nuclear power, and any remaining emissions in the electricity sector is basically from waste incineration plants. And as you can see in this chart, the bulk of the CO2 emissions in Switzerland is mainly in buildings and transport sector. Until 2008, the emissions were pretty much stable, but after 2008, because of the implementation of emission trading schemes and introduction of CO2 taxes, the emissions have been reduced by about 20%. However, the Swiss energy transition faces key challenges, and I list some of them here. One is the very limited renewable resources potential. Wind is not having large potential in Switzerland. Hydropower has already been exploited. Bioenergy is very small, mostly solar PV. There are seasonal balancing issues in electricity supply because of the water cycle due to the large share of hydropower. There are a lot of uncertainty and social opposition in domestic CO2 storage at the moment, while it is important for Switzerland to maintain its energy security and also the carbon-free electricity. And here I have some milestones in the Swiss long-term energy and climate policy. And as you can see, in 2015, Switzerland was the first country in the world submitting its climate action plan to UNFCCC ahead for the Paris Agreement. This happened in February 2015. And in 2018, Switzerland entered into force the new energy strategy that foresees the increasing of energy efficiency, the increasing of renewable energy, and the withdrawal of nuclear power. In 2019, the Swiss Federal Council committed officially to the net zero target for 2050. And in 2020, the Swiss Parliament voted for the revision of the CO2 law to meet the intermediate 2030 targets. And this year, while the Swiss Federal Council adopted the long-term climate strategy with the net zero target into the heart of the strategy, the Swiss population rejected the revision of the CO2 law in a referendum, which means that there's a very active debate at society and political levels at the moment. And InnoSwiss, the Swiss Innovation Agency, timely funded a project, which is the Swiss Competence Centers for Energy Research, with 250 million francs from 2013 to 2020. A franc is about $1.1 US, to finance 8 challenges related to the Swiss energy transition: buildings, industry, mobility, grids, electricity, bioenergy storage, and society. But there was also a joint activity, the so-called scenarios and modeling, with 5.6 million francs, lasted for the 2.5 years, that brought all these 8 SCCRs together to assess net zero pathways. And Paul Scherrer Institute, through me and my team, had a central role in this analysis because we operated the Swiss Times energy system model that produced these net zero pathways, where we received inputs like resources, technologies, climate impacts on hydropower demand from the other Swiss competence centers for energy research, and also gave inputs to them, outputs to them regarding the pathways for deeper sectoral analysis in buildings, industry, mobility, and grids. And the Swiss Times energy system model is a very detailed model based on the Times framework of IEA ETSAP. It combines a long-term horizon with a very high temporal resolution at 288 time slices to meet the fluctuations between electricity supply, heat supply, and demand as well. It has more than 90 energy end uses. It has electricity grid topology with 300 lines and voltage levels from very high to low voltage. It includes a computationally efficient unit commitment algorithm for the dispatching of the power plants, and also technical and market-based flexibility mechanisms like ancillary services markets and demand-side management. And if we look at the results of the net zero core scenario from STEM in the project of SCCR JASM, the main conclusion is that it's technically feasible for Switzerland to achieve net zero emissions in 2050. It requires a carbon-free transport and building sector and offsetting any remaining emissions in industry in the energy sector by deploying CO2 capture to the waste incineration plants that we have at the moment. But the challenge is that we need to start today because, as you can see here, within this decade, we need to have 3 times more heat pumps in buildings, to increase by 3 times the electric car sales, and also to install about 3 times the current solar PV capacity. And in 2050, because of the nuclear phase out, we need to have installed 27 gigawatts of solar PV, and this accentuates the seasonal imbalances in the system. To develop domestic hydrogen production, to be able to capture 9 megatons of CO2 with the challenge of what to do with the CO2 capture because of the uncertainties in this domestic CO2 storage, and to secure access to 15 terawatt hours of net imports of zero carbon fuels, of which 4 to be electricity. And if we look at the structure of the final consumption on the left, there is a substantial phase out of fossil fuels by 2050. This black line here is mainly gas that is used in industry. And these fossil fuels are substituted by biofuels, e-fuels, and hydrogen in industry and long-distance transport. There is a strong electrification and a strong deployment of renewables. This includes here environmental heat from heat pumps. So basically, this is a heat pump deployment. And if we look at the electricity demand per sector, we see that industry services and buildings, the traditional electricity consumers, even reduce their consumption because of the efficiency measures, while the additional increase in the electricity demand happens in transport due to the electrification. Electric cars alone need 7.5 terawatt-hours of electricity, and electrolysis, electricity for electrolyzers to produce hydrogen. And the electricity generation in Switzerland remains carbon-free even after the nuclear phase-out, which is completed by 2044, thanks to biggest deployment of solar power. But the production shifts to lower grid levels, and this calls for additional flexibility to the system, also from sectors beyond the electricity system. And if we look in the next chart in the electricity balance per season on the left, we see that in the winter, there is an electricity supply gap, which is filled by electricity imports of 6 terawatt-hours. And this may be small, but is needed in hours where also the neighboring countries are in a fever for electricity supply. And this is a challenge. While in summer, the excess electricity supply mainly from hydropower, because the hydropower plants, the hydropower reservoirs have a lot of water in summer, so there is excess electricity there, is entering into electrolysis for hydrogen production. And there is a large deployment of other flexibility options at different parts of the energy system, not only on the electricity system via pump storage, stationary batteries, but also thermal storage and hydrogen storage becomes important. Vehicle to grid becomes important as well. About 13% of the electric cars provide vehicle to grid services by 2050, while there is an increase of ancillary services demands and shifts of electricity in industry services and residential. And if we look a little bit on the CO2 capture, which becomes really very important for Switzerland, this chart here has two main challenges. First is that we need to export 6 megatons of CO2 because the domestic potential is very limited. It's only 50 megatons, which is enough to operate 1 gigawatt of gas turbine combined cycle with CCS for 25 years. And also we need to deploy and to have commercially available negative emission technologies within the next 20 years, actually, mainly BECCS and DACs. And the key question is how much does it cost, all of this? We have assessed plenty of scenarios. The net zero core scenario that I just presented requires on average 320 francs per capita and year for the next 30 years. But depending on the conditions under which the energy transition is achieved, the cost can range by a factor of 4. And higher costs are when there is a limited deployment of renewables and also a weaker integration of Switzerland into energy markets, international energy markets, because this requires expensive energy saving measures and production of domestic clean fuels, while lower costs are achieved when there is, of course, technical innovation, especially on batteries, hydrogen, and CCS, and a stronger integration of Switzerland into international markets, because this can lead to a more balanced deployment of low carbon options. And I would like to note in concluding my presentation that this work didn't only published on research journals, but also gained a lot of visibility in the Swiss media, newspapers, and elsewhere. And as conclusions, of course, there is the typical conclusions that we need to scale up clean energy technologies, electricity is a key energy carrier. But what came important out of this study is that when it comes to national analysis, we need to be very careful and we need to improve the realism of the modeled pathways. We need to account also for societal feasibility next to the technical feasibility. And also we need to scale down the national pathways because we need to identify local constraints in the deployment of technologies and also to identify best fit local decarbonization solutions. So that's all from my side, and Thank you very much for listening to me, and happy to take questions.
Great, thank you. Hannah?
Hi, thanks. Actually, this goes very nicely into my presentation, which is next after this, also with the National Times Model for Ireland. And Evangelos, I very much appreciated your last slide about the need to increase the realism and social acceptability of different transition pathways in these national mitigation plans. There's a lot of overlap between our study and yours. And how did you represent these? So we find in the very steep decarbonisation pathways to 2030, many of the model outputs are really driven by how quickly we assume that the system can change, rather than, so I kind of say cost optimization in big inverted commas now.
Right. As I said, this study was a big collaboration between all Swiss universities, which gave input into the Swiss Times energy system model. And we had also colleagues that were looking especially at the societal challenges by conducting surveys and acceptability assessments. So all these were entered into the model as side constraints in order to deviate from the cost optimal mitigation. And also regarding technical feasibility, we also got input from experts from industry, buildings, and grid sectors. And the model went into a very significant redesign and development to be able to increase the realism of the pathways, but still it's not enough. We need to do more, I think. Yeah, I'm very excited to look now at your presentation, what you do in Ireland, Hannah.
I love it when we have a perfect transition like this. So without further ado, our last, but by no means the least of our presentations, we're going to move to Ireland. And Hannah, please feel free to share and take the floor.
Yeah, so this, as I said, is a great segue, because this is a presentation which will report on, hold on, I always pause the share now it's resumed again. Okay, so this is a report of a study which we've been undertaking for about the past year, which has been simultaneously building a new energy systems model and applying it in sort of real time to an evolving policy situation in Ireland. So some context. So Ireland now has adopted a legally binding target to reduce all greenhouse gas emissions by 51% by 2030 relative to 2018. So in our assessment, this is second only to Denmark in terms of ambition there relative to 2018. In terms of ambition relative to 1990, we're not the kind of world leading, because as I'll show in later slides, we've had relatively low abatement in many sectors. And this challenge is compounded by the fact that we have one of the highest shares of agriculture emissions for a developed country. So now nearly 40% of our overall greenhouse gas emissions come from agriculture sector, because you all like our beef and our cheese very much, and our butter. And that doesn't even include our LULUCF emissions, which are net positive. So we've got a lot of drained grassland, very low forest cover, and LULUCF emissions are accounted for in our national target. So this target of the 51% was adopted in a climate act this summer, following a kind of basically the Green Party got into government last year and negotiated a coalition deal for a very ambitious decarbonisation trajectory. Some of the other things about Ireland which are interesting, that the sort of geographic and cultural and economic context, which is relevant beyond just agriculture, includes the fact that we're an island. So our grid is small, and it has very low connection to the European grid. We've got very high capacity for renewables. We've got one of the world's best wind capacities. I'm looking out over a very windy countryside here. And we've already mostly phased out coal. So coal and peat will be phased out imminently. So the challenge of both dramatically scaling up renewables to a target of 80% of generation by 2030 would be a very large technical challenge for the grid. And then on the demand sector side, we have high per capita emissions from transport and buildings as well. We've got carbon intensive fuels for heating our buildings, and we've got a car dependent society because of our kind of dispersed spatial patterns. So a lot of kind of, challenges that are not unique to Ireland, but compound this extremely challenging target. So we have in UCC been building the Times Ireland model in this Times platform, which Evangelos very nicely laid out. So a well-developed energy system optimization platform, which is developed in many countries and managed by the IEA ETSAP community. Just a quick summary, we give the model final energy demands, CO2 constraints, assumed current and future technology profiles, efficiency, resource availability, and user-defined constraints, which again kind of attune the model to realism in terms of policy, in terms of societal acceptance and the speed of transition. And then for given different scenarios, Tim calculates the least cost energy system meeting all these constraints, investments, emissions trajectories, total system cost, marginal energy prices. Tim is a successor model to the Irish Times model, which was built in UCC under Bruno Gallagher since for over 10 years. But basically, given the new model policy context, given a very kind of rapidly changing energy and landscape, and also to take advantage of new developments in the platform and the visualization, we basically rebuilt the model from the ground up. And I should have mentioned there several of the colleagues and former colleagues are on this session right now. So greetings and acknowledgements to you. So one of the very exciting things is that I was invited to participate in we have a climate change advisory council, much like the UK's climate change committee, which gives independent advice to the government on policy and on targets. And this new climate act kind of gave the climate advisory council the role of recommending Ireland's first carbon budgets. So as I mentioned already, we have high per capita emissions, and actually in 2020 there was a 3.6% fall in overall greenhouse gas emissions, which was actually less than the previous year, less than the fall in the previous year. We've had more coal online and growing agriculture emissions, and this only brought us back to our emissions in 1990. So there was a kind of a peak and we're back to 1990 levels. But with these very ambitious new targets, to reduce emissions by 4.8% per year in the first carbon budget period and 8.3% in the second carbon budget period. These are the carbon budgets recommended by the Climate Change Advisory Council, and we used the Times Ireland model, Tim, to inform the development of these carbon budgets as they were being discussed and as they were being kind of in a technical advisory committee that the council appointed. So we informed the employment, the GDP, various different, and the agriculture analyses. And of course, the national position is climate neutrality by 2050, so a net zero target. Again, this includes all greenhouse gases, of which a significant amount is methane and nitrous oxide from our agriculture sector, and this analysis just focuses on the energy system. But obviously meeting that 51% target requires a trade-off. You can either do an equal amount of mitigation from agriculture and the energy system, or given the fact that we have a kind of let's say a strong agriculture lobby who is resistant to reducing emissions very significantly. Right now, the abatement target for methane is around a 10% reduction by 2030, which would only bring us back to about 2015 levels of methane emissions. So while this slide benchmarks different mitigation scenarios against the ESR 1.5 scenarios for agricultural methane and CO2 emissions, and you can see here on the left, our methane emissions from agriculture rose by 20% over the period instead of fell, and to kind of come back to that period would require steep reductions. Obviously, using the base year and so on is a normative thing, but this is simply a benchmark. On the other hand, our CO2 emissions have not risen so dramatically, but basically each one of these colors is a scenario which the country as a whole meets the 51% target, but with different weights of efforts between energy and agriculture. Right now, the latest climate action plan has set a target that, which is the first step towards sort of agreeing the sectoral split between energy and agriculture, indicates that they expect that the agriculture sector to do something between 20 to 30%, which is kind of one of these kind of along this line, this purple or blue. I'm not sure if you can see my pointer, and that the energy system would reduce up to 60-70% by 2030. So that even the 51% target for the energy system actually will have to go up to 60 to 65% target, because we have a relatively low ambitions for agriculture. Anyway, the rest of this presentation will focus on the energy system. So in the Times Ireland model, which represents the energy system from all forms of supply and demand, we've modeled many different scenarios, but I highlight here 4 different core scenarios. So first, core scenario, which has business as usual energy demands, no bioenergy imports. This is reflective of the policy position. By 2030, 4 times the indigenous bioenergy consumption that we have now, no CCS, limited hydrogen, 4 times the level of variable renewables, mainly wind, by 2030. So sort of ambitious on renewables, but no big technology breakthroughs. And we show that if there's equal abatement between energy and agriculture, the marginal abatement cost, this is the average marginal abatement cost between 2025 and 30, is 600 euros a tonne. And that quickly goes to the 4-figure mark if the agriculture sector only reduces by 25%, and the energy system has 65%. And in individual years, that goes well over 2,000 euros a tonne. So I've kind of averaged it out here so that I'm not completely terrifying the policymakers when I present this to them. But then we've modeled a number of scenario variants, including a low energy demand scenario, which is led by a PhD student, Ankita Gaur, and she's writing that up and publishing it now, which brings down the marginal abatement costs significantly, but still, into very difficult territory for high effort in energy. And what I call a tech optimism case, which has up to 7 times the variable renewable capacity, the opportunity to invest in some CCS and import bioenergy and increase the domestic bioenergy capacity. And then we also layer on these 2 scenarios, which brings the marginal abatement cost into much more sort of feasible territory. I'll go through some of the energy system sort of results from here. I'll go quite quickly through this, but you can go through the slides or the paper as you wish. So fossil fuels are right now about 90% of our primary energy demand, falling slightly because of our wind, mainly oil and gas, but we also have coal and peat. And that needs to fall very dramatically, unsurprisingly, to between 45 and 56% in 2030, mainly with met by wind and renewables, but also an increase in bioenergy. Power generation here is a key bottleneck. It's unsurprising, but this is why I said in the comments that the speed at which we tell the model it can increase renewables is the key determinant of how much it takes. So it maximizes what we assume the renewable electricity capacity can take. There's big plans for offshore wind in Ireland, but it's still a nascent economy. And so the speed at which the low carbon electricity can be rolled out is a bottleneck for decarbonising the rest of the system. It requires this quadrupling of renewables capacity depending on the different scenarios. So here, power generation as well. A lot of our we're projecting potentially a doubling of electricity demand to 2030, depending on the scenario. A doubling is really shocking, but the main thing that's driving this is that we're not only specializing in producing cheese and beef and infant formula, we're also specializing in data centers, which are great, a very efficient way to produce power, but they're extremely large electricity users and are projected to account for between 1/4 and 1/3 of our total electricity demand by 2030. So this is a huge imposition on the energy system, as well as electrification of residential services and transport. So the level of electricity demand really determines the achievability of the 2030 target. I'll skip through the transport sector there. I think I heard a ding, and here's the final energy consumption for these sectors, depending on the level of abatement in 2030. I wanted to show you some of the process that we've gone through, and one of the really nice features of this process has been a web app developed by Alex Bailik, who I think is on the meeting at the moment. Developed a web app that you can find here for rapid results diagnostics, stakeholder engagement, and dissemination. So basically, we can generate a new URL depending on a set of scenario results to do do diagnostics, so we can increase the number of graphs, look at them in detail, compare results. So it's a quick visual kind of summary of different results, and we can use those to quickly send them to stakeholders or to kind of do dissemination. So now this is the web app that has been developed out of the study that informed the Climate Advisory Council's carbon budgets, for example, and that is frozen in time. And we have an archive on Zenodo of the full model results that can be linked to that, and a GitHub repository of the model itself. So the model files as well, we've made freely available. We're very kind of insistent on this transparency when we're feeding into the policy process. Tim becomes one of the few TIMES models which are available. There's the link to the GitHub repository there. You're welcome to come and feed in on that. And we've also deposited the draft paper on archive for open peer review. We've tried to follow a best practice development approach using Git for version control integration, this web app for results analysis and diagnostics, using the TIMES framework, which is well proven. Now the code is freely available as well. It's continuously developed and maintained with a global TIMES community. So we're kind of linking with other TIMES communities. I previously worked at the UCL Energy Institute on the UK TIMES model. We have expertise from Denmark as well. We've developed the model to be, because it's funded by government, a combination of government and research grants. So we're trying to develop the model so that there's simultaneously a kind of a stable, reliable, up-to-date, kind of boring policy model that we trust, and then a variance which can be broken and played with to produce research variance. So we're kind of trying to keep these parallel tracks and then bring the research variance into the core model when they're ready. And then, of course, we have this systems approach inbuilt into the model, where this sector coupling is integrated by design. We went through an extensive stakeholder review process earlier in the year, which informed a lot of the parameters about what the maximum take up and speed of different end use and supply technologies can be. And we're also doing training PhDs and so on. So just to wrap up and give some conclusions, a nice thing, and similar with the Evangelos presentation, is that it shows, and it has shown the policy community, that there is a path towards this target, that there is a feasible, but of course it's a narrow path for this rapid near-term decarbonisation. The very high marginal abatement cost is due to this really near-term ambition. We're only 8 years away from 2030, and a lot of the scenarios require early retirement, for example, of cars. So yeah, it shows a huge scrappage schemes required in the late 2020s. Small additional decarbonisation efforts lead to much higher marginal abatement costs, as you know, if agriculture does a little bit less, then energy has to do more, and that really pushes the marginal abatement cost to much higher. We have also modeled this low energy service demand scenario that makes the solution far easier and cheaper. So that kind of requires this concentrated policy effort in planning, mobility management, public education needed to achieve this LED scenario, a focus on data centers, for example. We haven't modeled what it will take to achieve the LED scenario. That's the next step. So we've just sort of have done what if, passenger transport decouples from growth and so on. Electricity, of course, is a key bottleneck. So we need to prioritize the efficient use of electricity, and scaling up zero carbon electricity is the top priority, and availability of bioenergy. So if we can't scale up some bioenergy, then it puts a lot of this out of reach as well. So the nice thing about this is it shows an integrated whole systems approach that helps to understand the interlinkages between sectors, prevent blind spots for policymakers who often look at in a kind of a siloed sectoral kind of focus, and it understands where the most valuable use for limited resources are. And we also want to look at it for distributional impacts. We want to concentrate on looking at sensitivity analysis, multi-model analyses we're strong on, and we want to look at pathways which maximize the co-benefits and reduce trade-offs. Be happy to have a conversation. This is a kind of a snapshot of the TIM development team with the various logos of the funding organizations and supporters. So thank you very much.